Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar on AI usage transparency and how to unlock AI governance and enable AI adoption across your organisation. As a quick introduction, my name is Dunya Lewis and I'm the co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer of AIUC Global. And my business partner and the second co-founder on the line with me is Chaim Oshchikir, and he's the CEO of AIUC Global. So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. We are grateful for the wisdom and care that has nurtured this land over countless generations, enabling us all to enjoy its richness even today. In terms of our agenda for today, we're going to be touching on some AI fundamentals just to make sure that everyone starts from at least a common starting point before moving on to how organisations are approaching AI adoption. We want to touch on some of the key risks that organisations are experiencing, so hopefully that's not going to be too negative a time of the session, and then run through some recommended activities and tools that you can use to manage these risks in your organisation. But a quick note before we continue, today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you after the session. And if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A section within Teams. So there should be a button up the top called Q&A that you can use to submit any questions, and you can do so anonymously as well. So to kick us off, let's look at the definition of AI that's recognised by the Australian government from the OECD. They have defined AI as a machine-based system that takes inputs that it receives, and from those inputs, it infers how to generate outputs such as predictions, content, and recommendations that then influence physical or virtual environments. This definition is actually quite broad because it doesn't just cover the generative AI or the agentic AIs that many of us are using today. So for example, with the generative AI that generates content based on some prompts that you enter and other inputs from the learning and the rules in the background. It also recognises things like motorised automations that we have had on factory floors for a number of years. It actually goes all the way back to the first robots in the 1920s. So over 100 years ago. We also had chatterbox that were created in the middle of last century, as well as medical diagnosis tools and recommendation tools from the 1970s, many of which we would classify these days as machine learning rather than AI. So although it might seem like we're rushing into these technical implementations, the technology journey here has actually spanned over a century, which makes me feel a little bit old, with computing power being one of the key constraints that was holding us back from the changes we have seen more recently. But let's go a step further into more commonly AI-labelled systems. At a very high level, when we lift the hood, it's important to understand that there are multiple components that make up an AI product. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Matt Mueller from Volano for the brilliant way he articulated this in a recent event, which this has formed the basis of the content here. Firstly, we have training. This is the process where AI learns from the data that it has been fed or provided. But from stories of books that have been pirated to make them easier to digitally consume and obviously lower cost, cultural art being consumed without any care for its sensitive nature, digital erasure challenges, and the immense power and water consumption required to undertake the activity, this space is definitely littered with plenty of unfavourable headlines. We then move on to the model, which is the system that processes and analyses the data. This is the LLM or GPT 4.1, 5, or Gemini 2.5. But keep in mind that most of us have only scratched the surface with what we know. There are some claims out there that of 2 million plus models existing, some general, some purpose-built, for example, in research with specific training and development approaches being applied. And there are rumours that product companies are being accused of swapping models in and out without any transparency to the end user. We then have inference, which is how AI applies what it's learned to new data. So similar to what we were talking about earlier, where we look at the inputs, for example, and what the users have entered into the interface, such as the prompts, the context, the guidance, as well as the rules that are built into the interface itself about what it should and shouldn't be consuming or passing through. And I recognise that there's been a significant uplift in the maturity and accessibility of some of these tools, but as mentioned earlier, they've been worked on and slowly deployed into our ecosystem for a very long time. And what we're experiencing now has been theorised for decades, although it's come a little bit earlier than expected, with some reports talking about being 25 years ahead of where we were expecting to be. Now, in terms of the ways that organisations are actually adopting AI, there are 4 different approaches that organisations seem to be taking. The first one is to pretend that it's just hype, that it will pass. And I'll also put the organisations that are putting blanket bans on AI usage into this category. There's also the other extreme, where you have organisations that jump all in, some base this on the trust of their people or a lack of capacity to do anything else. But generally, there's no governance, there's no policies, there's no procedures, there's nothing in place to actually control the way that AI is being used within the organisation, which may work for some, but we don't recommend it for most. And the size of organisations that are doing this is quite varied, with some of our large organisations here in WA taking this approach. Other organisations take a more slow and steady approach. They take small steps to implement AI through pilots and experimentation in small teams. And the last option are the organisations that are lining up all of their ducks in a row, so all of their governance, policies, procedures and training, possibly deploying tools in-house so that they can have more control over what data sets they're being informed by. But one thing to take note of is that no matter where you are on the scale, there's certain risks that propagate through all of them. And that includes even if your organisation isn't actively doing anything, because your staff more than likely are. And even if you are trying to line everything up within your organisation, many of the risks still apply because of the behaviours of the staff that work within your organisation and the nature of the tools that they are using. So we'll jump to some of the risks. The first one is reputational damage. There have been plenty of scandals related to AI usage, from tools having hallucinations that provide completely inaccurate content with authority to misrepresented references and the combination of the two. But a recent and well-published example raised questions on using AI to generate referenceable material. So I just wanted to raise that this is going to become harder and harder for all of us. There was an example study done by the Columbia Journalism Review. They took extracts from 20 known existing published articles that were widely available on the internet, and they asked the different models to go and find the source of the quotes that they were searching for. As you can see, yes, there were some that came back with successful references, but by far the majority was confidently inaccurate. And in some of these situations, the conclusions that researchers came to is that the more you pay, the more inaccurate the result was. And they theorised that the more expensive versions were expected to provide a confident response, where it was okay for the cheaper versions to just say, I don't know. And with the volume of AI-generated content having now outpaced AI-free content earlier this year, and the hallucinations and inaccuracies in that content, we have to be very mindful that without clear AI usage classifications, verified sources may well become a thing of the past. So moving along, we also have legal ramifications from copyright infringements. For example, we've had AI-generated slop, so that's one of the new words that's coming out, with an example here of an author who found an AI-generated biography based on his memoir with many inaccuracies that he knew nothing about, that had his name, but somebody else's face on it. And when we look at false or misleading claims, there's been a few examples of things like chatbots on websites offering cars for $1 or refunds on flights. And these mistakes are being enforced in courts when companies are trying to refuse to honour them. And one close to my heart is bias in the AI systems. It's really important that, particularly when we're talking about generative AI content, that we recognise that there is bias in the way that the systems infer meaning from the inputs, but also the limitation of the information that has trained the systems themselves. For example, recently LinkedIn had provided us with the option of opting out of our content and our posts being used in learning models for their AI solutions. And for example, I originally said no, but I later realized that if everyone who belonged to the variety of minority groups that I belong to, if everyone chose to opt out of having our posts and our language and our engagement style from being included in the learning engine, we actually risk the digital erasure from that particular LLM, which means that all outputs from that model will not have considered the way that we speak, the way that we approach things, or the way that we engage in its learning algorithms. But if you think more broadly, around the world, many countries don't have the scale of access to generate and publish content. History books may not reference them, so that digital erasure is a serious concern and underpins much of the bias in these systems, although it's not the only cause. And then there's some other risks as well. One of them is over-reliance. A number of people are starting to lose the ability to generate their own coherent content, which causes problems, especially for people who are, for example, doing research who later have to answer questions real time about the content that they've developed. We also know that the major use of AI at the moment is therapy and companionship, according to a survey completed by the Harvard Business Review. That, especially in a corporate setting where tools have been deployed that have not been configured to at least attempt to prevent them from providing therapy or companionship, we run the risk that, for example, it might give misleading information about how to deal with conflict in the workforce, resulting in dismissal. It might lead to misleading information about how to deal with a financial situation, resulting in a loss of home or any number of other horrific scenarios. And we don't have any case law at the moment to say who's responsible. But if something happens with an automated vehicle that an organisation has deployed on site and I'm injured, the company is liable. So one would assume the same would be the case with this technology. And then we're also talking about privacy and security vulnerabilities. The big one everyone talks about is confidential information being uploaded into uncontrolled AI tools and ending up in the public domain, or even internal systems being used for analysing things like HR data, only to find it available to all staff, exposing highly confidential information like wages or workers' comp details. But something else to consider, because people are using it so much for therapy and companionship, they're sharing deeply personal information. Firstly, this information can be subpoenaed by a court. There are no doctor-patient confidentiality privileges, and even if you delete the chats, they're retained for this purpose. So ChatGPT, for example, has to retain all deleted chats in case they're subpoenaed for a court case. But also the sharing of personal information, like quotes from favourite books or movies and songs, with the cyber moves over the years to get people to use longer passwords, people have been given instructions to use phrases that they will remember. And this is content that many use. So there is a risk around providing insight into password patterns, but also the scale of personal information that we're releasing, if it got out, is a feeding ground for social engineering attacks that are beyond any scale of sophistication that we've ever seen before. But all's not lost. If you're going down the path of lining everything up, deploying your own tools, or carefully setting configuration settings for licensed apps, telling users that they're only allowed to use your sanction tools in your policies, except not quite. Because there's this thing called shadow AI that organizations are experiencing quite a lot of, which is when users are doing everything but. According to this KPMG report, 44% of users are using AI in ways that contravene any policies or guidelines. And therefore, the typical mitigations that we've put in place in the past in some areas, like policies and monitoring of use and filling the void with in-house tools or blocking access, assuming you have the in-house capacity and capability to apply these controls, they don't necessarily work because people just use their own devices. So what can you do? Our first recommendation is that all organisations and all people must realise that it doesn't matter what you're doing or not doing. The risks that we've listed here are already playing out. But you can't just throw it to your IT and your GRC teams, because centralised oversight alone can't control personal intent. And policies aren't enough, like we said earlier. And threatening people with compliance penalties doesn't work, because you're also demanding that every day they're doing more with less. but time is of the essence. Unlike health and safety, for example, which took decades to get to cultural embedment, at least here in Western Australia, where the mining industry is so prevalent, we don't have the time for organic or organisational push cultural change that takes that long. And we can't wait for regulatory controls when the risks are so significant and they're here now. And people are also very anxious about their jobs. They're concerned that they will be replaced by the technology that we've barely scratched the surface of, that if they tell anyone about the tools that they're using, that their bosses are going to turn around and say, well, what do I need you for? So we need to apply more control than we think that we have in this space. But how do we control, govern, and regulate what we can't see? Which is where transparency seems to be coming in. And since we embarked on this journey with AIUC Global, nationally we've seen governing bodies come together to form guidelines with usage transparency, for example, included as the #1 priority in the ethical AI use in marketing. We've seen international laws from the EU AI Act demand transparency on especially deep fakes, so that completely AI generated space. And also Chinese AI labeling regulations recognise the criticality of nuanced usage transparency. And these have extraterritorial reach, so if you're working with these jurisdictions, even if you're not actually operating in those countries, you are expected to be transparent. But beyond labelling everything as AI generated, if it's been touched by AI, it would appear that no one's cracked the code of how to be transparent. Or maybe they have, but we'll get to that in a minute. The next recommendation is the conversation. If we want open conversations, each of us, every single person, has to consider our opinions and biases on AI, because we really need to move away from the polarizing conversations that are happening at the moment. AI is neither good nor bad. These tools have a place and a purpose that they can be used for effectively, safely, and responsibly, but that needs to be a conscious choice. We believe that when a piece of work is being assigned, the first thing that the teams should be discussing is if AI should be used. This allows everyone to contribute to the conversation and raise any concerns or risks from a privacy concern or flaws in the models to watch out for. One of the things that we came across when we were doing the original design of the AI usage classifications is this very simple decision tree to identify if it's safe to use AI. And now I'm going to get his name wrong, Alexander Tilknov actually put this together way back when, a few months after Gen AI or ChatGPT was made available to everyone. So the first question that we talk to here is, does it matter if the output is true? Sometimes creative fun things, they don't require accuracy, so yes, it's safe to use generative AI. But if the output validity or truthfulness is important, the second question is, do you or someone in your team have the expertise to validate and verify whether the output is accurate? And if you don't, then the statement is it's unsafe to use AI. If you do have the expertise to verify the content, then the next question is, are you willing to take full responsibility for any inaccuracies? Now, this, when I first saw it, sounded a little bit scary, but it's something that we've always taken on ourselves. If someone told me that the content that I was providing in this presentation was wrong, it's my responsibility to correct it. So if I'm willing to continue to take that on, I can use AI. Some organisations have gone as far as putting a simple line in their code of conduct to reflect this expectation that we take accountability for the outputs of our work. And if not, then it goes back to possibly sticking with what you know rather than what you can find out there. We should also be talking about which AI tools the staff want to use in order to get the outcome that they're after. Are these sanctioned, or is there something that they know about externally that we should be considering? The market is moving so quickly that it's going to be difficult for an organisation to keep up with staff preferences and demands. But having these conversations openly means that the risk of using unapproved tools are discussed, and where needed, safeguards are agreed upon to protect the organisation and the people. And also there's skipped one. What is the organisation expecting? What does the organisation want? What is the AI mandate? Because sometimes there's a misalignment between what the team members want to do and what the management want them to do, especially internationally. We haven't heard as much about it here in Australia, but internationally, we're seeing a significant push for a broader AI usage. But this is all well and good. But like we mentioned earlier, people are still worried about being replaced. So it's critical that we find a way to recognise the human effort and involvement in the generation of content and outputs. But the question is, how do we do this? Outside of AI-generated it was always going to be one word, watermarks and auto-applied content credentials that claim that AI may have been used. We don't have nuanced language that talks about the scale of AI usage or how to encourage transparency and recognise human input until now. This is where the AI usage classifications that were developed by us, so AIUC Global, do come in. We have 5 classifications. Obviously, the two ends of the spectrum of AI, where now AI is used in the generation, design, or development of the artifacts or content, and AI generated, where something is entirely generated by AI. But we also have human-led, where AI has only been used to make minor tweaks, so tone, optimizations, corrections without impacting the original intent of what was created or designed. It might be rephrasing or grammar adjustments, or, for example, like lighting adjustments on photos. We also talk about co-created, where AI has been used to iteratively expand on the concept to create the final artifact, product or content. And lastly, AI-led, where once something has been generated by AI, a human has made minor adjustments or corrections to the generated item. These classifications use nuanced language that moves us away from those polarizing conversations and judgmental conversations and encourages effective and efficient AI use where appropriate. These classifications can be used to trigger the proactive AI usage planning conversations mentioned above, whilst protecting staff from having their work undervalued. Through these conversations and the implication of classification, all content, both internal and external stakeholders, can also identify appropriate levels of diligence that need to be applied over created artifacts and content. And this leads to that distribution of the risk management activities, because no longer is it just the governance or the cyber teams that are getting people to think before they do something. The grassroots of the organisation is doing so for themselves, helping the organisation as a whole take control of what is currently invisible. And because governance, like we mentioned earlier, cannot be achieved with centralised oversight alone, by embedding disclosure into personal intent and allowing our stakeholders and customers, or we allow our stakeholders and customers to engage with trust. And since we don't want to stifle creativity, much to possibly Haim's horror, in addition to the white background badges and the various formats available in the personal and team, for our personal and team clients, our professional and corporate clients also get access to the transparent badges and a couple of the subclass variations mentioned here. The first one is for uncontrolled documents, where you may be releasing branded content in an editable format and you want to protect your brand from being compromised by other people's updates to the content presented. So all badge formats come with the uncontrolled subclassification for the professional and corporate clients. And sometimes we also have caveats, like this presentation. Not sure if you've seen the little scatterings of the labels throughout the presentation, but the overall presentation was human-led. But one slide had a few AI-led images that would have pushed that slide over to the co-creation classification. So, for example, I could have labelled each of the individual images, or I could have classified the overall slide as co-created. The second example, or the third example, is slightly more controversial, which has been in the news a lot lately. So the $440,000 Deloitte report that, after being published, was found to have invalid references to published works and judge and legal quotes. And Deloitte have been put through the ringer for this, but reports have mistakes in them all the time, and they're just corrected and everyone moves on generally. And I want to take a moment to mention that none of the findings or the recommendations that were modified in this report when the new version was accepted and republished by the client And as a side note, one of the other big four went through something very similar at exactly the same time as this story was breaking, and yet somehow got away with significantly less fanfare. That's not really the softest way that I could explain or describe that media frenzy. So yes, mistakes were made, and we can all learn from this scenario. But from especially my point of view, we couldn't champion the end of judgmental conversations without pointing out that the scale of disrespect and degradation that has been thrown at the writers and reviewers of this document is unwarranted, even if the review processes could have been better implemented. Having said that, you're welcome to imagine how much easier it would have been for everyone to avoid the whole thing if the reviewers, both internally and on the client side, knew what areas were co-created and enriched using AI. But to bring it up to a slightly lighter note, we also encourage everyone to use the hashtags in your posts on social media. They don't require registering, so you're free to champion transparency across your network. So a quick recap. Judge your judgments and empower your team to openly discuss risks, innovation opportunities, and which AI tools they want to use and which ones they should use. And make sure that all the work is classified to enable appropriate levels of quality assurance and also to build trust with stakeholders and consumers once things are published. And if you want to start your AI usage classification journey today and work to distribute AI risk management across your organization, you can also head to the website now and use the RISK20 code to claim your 20% discount. We've also just launched a personal license in case getting your organization to agree is a little too big of a leap. You can lead by example, and just note that you should only be using that license for internal purposes. And that brings us to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you've benefited from what was covered. As Dunia mentioned, we will share the information with you offline. And yeah, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to us via contact@aiuc.global, our LinkedIn page, and obviously our website has all the information and everything that you need to know. So again, thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.